Hello, I'm Brianna Bach, a board member for the Victoria Festival of Authors. Welcome to The Magical Writer, QTIPOC Authors Dissect Magical Realism, featuring authors Larissa Lai, Rasiqra Revulva, and Josh Whitehead. Though this is a virtual event, Victoria Festival of Authors is located on the traditional ancestral territories of the Lekwungen people, also known as the Songhees and Esquimalt nations. We acknowledge the ancestors, hereditary leaders, and matriarchs, as well as the creators from these lands, and give thanks for the privilege of living and working here. We are committed to serving as listeners and learners. Thank you to our sponsors, the BC Arts Council, Canada Council of the Arts, the CRD, the City of Victoria, Access Copyright, the Victoria Foundation, and Monroe's Books. Thanks also to the League of Canadian Poets, who has sponsored Rasiqra's appearance at our festival, and the Writers' Union of Canada, who has sponsored Josh. This event, as all VFA events, offers closed captioning. Please click the double C at the bottom of your screen to view the captions. Please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen if you have questions for us or for the authors during the event. The moderator will be able to get you some of these questions near the end of the panel. This panel is curated and moderated by Danny Ramadan. Danny is a Syrian-Canadian author and advocate for LGBTQ+ refugees. His debut novel, The Clothesline Swing, was shortlisted for the Lambda Literary Award and longlisted for Canada Reads. He has an MFA in creative writing from UBC and lives with his husband in Vancouver, BC.
Thank you so much, Brianna, for the introduction, and thank you to the Victoria Festival of Authors for inviting me yet again. I'm so happy I am with you here today, folks, here from my hotel room in Victoria. I reside, of course, back in Vancouver on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. And as an immigrant, as somebody who arrived here unaware of the dynamics of what colonization was, until I arrived here and I sought that knowledge, I would like to send thanks to the folks who offered me this knowledge, who welcomed me even when I was uninvited on those territories. I have such a fantastic event planned for you today. I have three icons of the queer writing scene in Canada. I am so looking forward to hearing them speak and read. I flirt with some of them. I listen to others. I feel so connected to all of those fantastic folks. Just before we start, I want to remind you that you are welcome to share your questions with us. So anytime during the event, if you felt like there's a question that is burning for you, you just hit that Q&A section and fill the field and send me the question and I'll be able to read it. Don't be a jerk and write beautiful questions, or else I'm just going to delete them. I'm so looking forward to talking to you today about the idea, the concept, the conflict within the genre we know as magic realism. It's such an interesting topic to look at, specifically in connection with our identities as queer folks, as trans folks, as two-spirit, or as folks of color in general. I find that sometimes we as marginalized writers get the stamp of approval from the mainstream community, from the white heteronormative community, when we write in the theme of magic realism. It feels something that is told that we fit within, even when we don't attempt to be part of it. And it feels so modern as well. It doesn't feel like something that connects to the heritage of myself or the many folks that are I'm welcoming today to. And it's even modern for the white heteronormative society. I highly doubt that A Midnight Summer Dream by Shakespeare was called magic realism back in the day. So I have a lot of questions about this, specifically as somebody who writes in what is known as magic realism. Today, we are navigating this beautiful conversation with three fantastic folks that I really admire. I'm going to introduce them one after the other. So I have Larissa Lai. Larissa Lai is a queer icon and the author of Tiger Flu, Saltfish Girl, and Iron Goddess of Mercy, recipient of the Duggins Novelist Prize, the Lambda Award, and the Astrea Award. She holds a Canada Research Chair at the University of Calgary, where she directs the Insurgent Architects house for creative writing. I also have Rasiqra Revulva. Rasiqra Revulva is a disabled queer femme writer, artist, editor, musician, and performer, to name a few of the amazing things that she does. She heads publicity and co-edits the new hybrid section at Puritan magazine and creates music and art with electronic duo The Databats. Her work is Cephalopography 2.0, which is her award-nominated debut glitch illustrated poetry collection. I hope I said that word correctly.
Perfectly.
Perfect. Thank you. I'm glad to hear. And Joshua Whitehead, who is my friend that I've never met in my life. I'm really looking forward to one day meeting you in real life. This must have been like what, the 12th panel that we are on?
It's been a while, yeah.
Joshua Whitehead is an OG Cree Two-Spirit member of Big Weave First. Did I say that correctly?
Pegwis.
Big West First Nations Treaty 1. He is the author of a full metal, Indigi Queer, and Johnny Appleseed, as well as the editor of Love After the End, an anthology of Two-Spirit and Indigi Queer speculative fiction. Currently, he is an assistant professor at the University of Calgary, where he is housed in the departments of English and International Indigenous Studies, as well as on the top best-selling list with his latest, Making Love with the Land. I'm so happy I have you here, folks. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm lucky that I can pick up the phone and ask you to join me on panels, and you'll all be like, yeah, sure, we'll do it. So thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so who is ready for some readings? I would like to start with you, Larissa, if that's okay. Are you ready to share some of your beautiful art?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Danny. Thank you so much for inviting me in, for that wonderful and generous introduction. It's such a joy and pleasure to be here. Excuse me. Oh, just swallowed the wrong way. I'm just going to read a little bit from my new novel, The Lost Century, that it's just hot off the press, just came out this past week. It's early. It's not even released to bookstores for another month. I'm going to read from the point of view of one of the three main women characters in the novel. She's not yet out of the closet yet. There's a little jealousy situation unfolding here. One of the things that I'm trying to think about, I think, in this section is how there's queerness also, you know, in traditional people. And yeah, so that's this character. Did I say the novel is about the Japanese occupation of Hong Kong? But this section is just prior, so none of that has happened yet. She's going to see a fortune teller. Finally, it was Tingyan's turn. Her heart raced with excitement and fear. General curse or specific curse? Granny Kwok asked. She wore a pantsuit in brightly patterned fabric, flashier and more contemporary than Tingyan's traditional garb. Several of her teeth were missing, though one of the ones that remained was capped in gold. Her face was spattered with liver spots. Her eyes shone bright and lively. Specific curse, Tingyan said. It will cost you more, said Granny Kwok. How much? Tingyan asked. Granny Kwok named an exorbitant amount. Tingyan, well raised as a bargainer by her mother, Kwan Siu-wai, argued and quibbled, but the granny stood her ground. She could smell desperation and determination. She knew her worth and insisted on her price. Tingyan made to leave. Granny Kwok said, fine, why don't you go to Granny Chan's stall? See if anything works out for you, ever. Tingyan saw that her ruse was not going to work. She sighed. She handed the old woman the sum requested. You drive a hard bargain, Granny Kwok. Once she'd been paid, Granny Kwok's demeanor shifted. Her broad face went soft, and a tone that conveyed genuine concern entered her voice. What sorrow brings you here today, daughter? Tingyan poured it out, her long and patient love for duckwing since they were little children, the days of kite flying together, or combing the beach for shells, the sunsets, the hand-holding, the longing gazes. The laughter too, the harmless pranks, the wind-up chicken she had put in his suitcase. And then the trip to Berlin, the sudden coldness, the appearance of that glossy Emily Ma Wai. I should mention this scene is set in 1937, so it's just after the Berlin Olympics in 36. By the time she told the tale of last night's dinner and the presence of the newlyweds when she arrived at the Cheng's house in Daihang, she was a bawling, howling mess, drenched in self-pity. Water gushed from her eyes and nose. She horked up a great wad of snot. She coughed and then spat on the ground. "We will fix it, child," Granny Kwok said kindly. "We will fix it." Tingyan mustered a small smile through her tears. "You have to be sure, though," Granny Kwok said, "because it will require a serious curse." Her eyes grew wide and gentle. "I'm sure," Tingyan sniffled. "In all honesty, I'd advise you against it," said Granny Kwok. "I want them to suffer." "Okay," said Granny Kwok, her eyes narrowed. "I'll warn you, though, my curses are very effective." "Good," said Tingyan. "I should hope so." She wrote her name, animal sign, and birth date on Granny Kwok's packet of spirit papers. On the boy and girl petty person paper, she wrote Duckwing and Emily's names, animal signs, and birth dates. She smeared pork grease from a little dish that Granny Kwok provided onto the mouth of a neatly folded three-dimensional paper tiger that Granny also handed her, so that it would be well disposed toward her as it journeyed through the spirit world. On a stool in front of her, with a brick atop the seat, Granny Kwok beat the effigies of Duckwing and Emily with an old shoe and chanted, "Hit your wicked hand, gain nothing that you planned. Hit your wicked eye, this is how you die. Hit your wicked arm, open you to harm. Hit your wicked chest, may you never rest. Hit your wicked groin, demons may you join. Hit your wicked foot, cover you in soot." The beating continued until the repetition of curses droned in Tingyan's ear, and she saw in her mind's eye an army of demons descending on her enemies. When the paper had been beaten to a pulpy mess, Granny Kwok stuffed it into the belly of the paper tiger, set the tiger alight, and dropped it into the ritual ash basket. Tingyan watched its striped face go up in flames. As it burned, Granny fed the flames with gold and silver colored papers in a stack that Tingyan had written her name on. Granny chanted blessings for Tingyan. She waved burning spirit money over Tingyan's head to chase away the evil spirits. She followed with a thick bunch of smoldering joss sticks. The smoke permeated her skin and Tingyan relaxed. "Nearly done," said Granny Kwok. "We just need to ask the spirits if they've heard your prayers." She threw a pair of moon blocks and one landed on its side while the other landed flat against the table. "Yin and yang together," she said. "The world is in balance. The spirits have heard us." Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Larissa. As always, I can always tell that this is your writing because you have such a strong, beautiful voice. It just like penetrates through screens and come to us. It's fantastic. Thank you so much for your reading. I really appreciate it. Rasiqra, I come to you. I heard you train a minute ago before we start, and I'm really looking forward to this. So let's hear it from you, my friend.
Thank you so much. And that was a wonderful introduction. I'm so excited to be here, more than a little bit intimidated, but not going to let that stop me. What a beautiful reading to begin with as well. Thank you so much, Larissa. Okay, so I'm going to be reading 3 poems, 2 of which are from my debut collection, Cephalopography 2.0, which came out in 2020 through Woolsack and Wynne. And the final poem is the first cephalopod poem that I wrote after completing the book 2 years later. So I'll give very brief introductions before doing each reading. So the first poem is called Tool Use, and it is both the first poem I ever wrote for the collection and the first cephalopod poem that I ever wrote. It is a poem that imagines evolutionary branching as a function of diaspora. using the veined octopus encountering a coconut shell and the way that it engages with this coconut shell, which to me seemed very reminiscent of the movements of the chambered nautilus, which is another type of cephalopod that is quite removed, evolutionarily speaking, but they experience a great deal of connection and an ability and an inability to communicate or to commune based on living in completely different environments.
Tool use. In my claimed shell, I face away. In undulation, I whisper across leagues to the silk-ridged helm, the chambered age and privilege dividing us, and I could slip between these curving fibers, boneless, painless, parting the downy spines with 8 fluttering tips, separate and eager, before shunting all, feet and head inside, and live in the hollow bowl, and seek you in that space. Though my found shell blocks off the waves, I still believe will bear me you on waters I may never taste. So I still face away to mitigate the favor of leagues and genes and years. In the evolutionary diaspora of the deep sea, every husk a talisman in a liquid world.
This next poem is a found poem, which draws the majority of its text from an article written by Dr. Mike Vecchione, who is works for the Smithsonian, is one of the preeminent cephalopod scientists in the English-speaking world. And the article in question is called Squids and More from Dive 04, referring to a very unusual sighting, which was disseminated through a lot of, I guess, popular science and then more popular news media, less and less accurate every time, very bizarre game of telephone. And I was very intrigued by that, this way that these observations become divorced from the knowledge and the specificity of what is true about them. And this poem is called Twisted Squidster. Contorted posture, assuming the presence, defensive to such an extreme degree, because we have sampled the community extensively, photoshopping to be consistent, noteworthy and more difficult, determining the identity that is common, straightforward. Half appeared to be oversized, it clearly belonged. They are sometimes misleading, photophores scattered, distinguishing is difficult, a small, clear spot, deeply embedded. Contorted posture, assuming the presence, defensive to such an extreme degree, because we have sampled the community extensively, photoshopping to be consistent, noteworthy and contorted more difficult, posture, determining the identity presence that is common, straightforward, defensive, half appeared to be oversized, it because we have sampled the community, they are sometimes misleading, photoshopping to be distinguishing is noteworthy and small, more difficult, clear spot, deeply embedded. Contorted determining posture, the assuming the presence, defensive to such an extreme degree, appeared because we have sampled extensively, photoshopping to be consistent, noteworthy and contorted posture, determining the identity that is common, distinguishing is difficult, appeared an extreme degree, it because we have sampled the community, they are sometimes misleading, photoshopping scattered to be distinguishing noteworthy and more difficult, deeply embedded. contorted determining the present, an extreme degree, appeared because photoshopping to be note and contorted posture, assuming a present that is common, distinguishing offensive, appeared in extreme degree. It becomes the community are sometimes misleading. Photoshopping scattered to be distinguishing is noteworthy and more deeply embedded. Contorted determining the assuming the presence, defensive to such an extreme degree, because to be overstudied extensively, photoshopping to be consistent, noteworthy and contorted posture, assuming the presence is appear in extreme size, because we have sampled the community are sometimes misleading. Photoshopping scattered to be distinguishing is noteworthy and more difficult. Clear spot. Deeply embedded. And the final poem that I'm going to be reading for you is called Cephalopography, or it could also, I suppose, be called Morphology and Anatomy, Cephalopography, because that's a series. Morphology and Anatomy is a series that comes up a lot in Cephalopography 2.0, and consequently, all of my other cephalopod poems. This piece is a ghazal which interpolates lyrics from REM's Stand, which is a terrific song. And obviously, when one listens to it, immediately what comes to mind must be the bobtail squid and the vertical migration it undergoes every day, right? I mean, that's completely natural. Who wouldn't make that association? So my final poem, and yes, I hope you enjoy. Looking forward to the conversation and to hearing the next reading.
Cephalopography. Shimmying submersion, sunlit sajda. Prostrate in dull substrate, this too, Ypremna. Sand camouflaging exquisite patina. The sun on the ground, this too, Ypremna. Phantoms glimmer a tessellated mirror. The wonder where you are, this too, Ypremna. Moon song arousing each watery cinder. If you are confused, this too, Ypremna. Benthic, littoral, perpetual hajra. Carry a compass, this too, Ypremna. Mucosal shedding, unearthing, Ypremna. Sorority, enveloping, Rasiqra.
Thank you.
No, thank you. That was fantastic. I am so thankful that you are with us today, and I'm so thankful I get to platform your fantastic art. Thank you so much for sharing. I've never experienced something as like your art, and I'm so happy that I got to do this today. So thank you. I appreciate you. Joshua, my friend. Hey, Josh. Do you want to jump in and follow that, please?
Well, I'll try. That was amazing. That really kind of brought me back to like the early work of like Jordan Abel. So thank you for that. I just remember he would perform with this like mask and had these lights, and it was like everything was looping. Also, that was kind of like ASMR. I could listen to that and fall asleep in the best of way and dream wild dreams. Well, speaking of dreaming, I'm going to be reading from my newest book of nonfiction, Making Love with the Land, in which I kind of interrogate magic realism and like genre as a whole. Basically, I guess the theses of this, one of them anyways, is if I'm going to be decolonial on the land and not recognize border, a province or nation or territory, I need to do it on the page as well. And I find genre and form very debilitating in that sense. So I'm going to read from an essay entitled My Body is a Hinterland, which details living with insomnia, but also the gifts of insomnia as well. And it's almost like delightful to be here with Larissa, who was the supervisor to some of this. Now we're like full circle and as colleagues now. So it's lovely to see you, Larissa. I miss seeing you in the hallways, but this was just as good.
Hey, Josh.
Hey, it's nice to see you. So this piece is basically, it's about dreaming. What does dreaming offer us? Is dreaming a creative praxis? And really kind of filtered through an Indigenous lens. I guess I'll just quickly say, so my father, when I was in my teens, like early teens, had kidney cancer, in which it was removed, had reoccurring bouts with that cancer returning. And so they had this medicine woman come in who was a Anishinaabe. Her name is Lillian. And I just remember my parents were having conversations about them, and I've always been very attuned to dreams and nightmares. And she had asked, does he fly? Does Joshua fly in his dreams? And I very much always did and do. And she told him just to witness that only storytellers fly in dreams. So this is coming after that. As I dream, my bed becomes a knob between worlds, the ledge upon which I perch to witness. I have this recurring dream, one that happens many times a year, especially in times of extreme stress. My body, in its breathing, knows when it is coming, and as I lull into sleep, I prepare. The dream features me standing on a grid of pixels and glowing line work, much like the background of the film Tron. And in the middle of the grid sits a sphere that continually widens in its limited space. I move towards the edge of this digital world as the sphere expands, filling my hearing with increasing volumes of intersecting voices and electrical hissing, until it becomes unbearable to stand without clutching my ears. As the sphere balloons to the point of threatening to knock me off the skirting of this world, the collective sound now a deafening screech, I focus on one voice, a guide in some semblance, and pound meaning into the soundscape. This is when I fall, but I'm caught and held by oratories, and I wake into newer resolutions and brighter revolutions. The dream teaches me to listen, and to listen fiercely, to focus on what is pleading to be heard, crying in unison, and to engage with it. Readers of my work might remember some of these ruminations in Full Metal Indigiqueer, dreams of automatons and atomic apexes, of saviors armored in codex and machinery, or may remember in Johnny Appleseed, Johnny's raptured the day after tomorrow orca crying tsunami nightmare, one I share continually with him, or his famous bear topping scene, a dream I too had while finishing the manuscript in the mountains of Banff. As a child, I was horrifically obsessed with those tabloid magazines in the checkout lines of our local grocery stores. As my mom would ring through groceries, I'd survey these publications, Sun Magazine, Weekly World News, and The Inquirer. Often they'd have hilarious headlines such as, Hillary Clinton adopts alien baby, Bigfoot diet, he loses 150 pounds and it can work for you too, and mini mermaid found in tuna sandwich. Though more often than not, these magazines sensationalized apocalypse reading, is this the end of the world? The final days Armageddon, and the Antichrist is alive and living in the US. Also was a president at one time, but let me continue. As an adult surveying child me, my fascination with and hyperbolic fear of the end blossomed through these readings, and of course the heightened cultural moments of Y2K, a day in which I sincerely thought the world would end through atomic warfare, and a purported doomsday of 2012. Even outside the supermarket, I was bombarded by doom. Jehovah's Witnesses would hand out copies of The Watchtower and Awake to me as I walked to school with their headlines of Death, is it really the end? And Armageddon, what is it and when will it come? Accompanied by terrifying images of disaster painted in a Rockwellian fashion. I'm tickled by the irony now, as a two-spirit indigenous person, that I was afraid of the apocalypse, for surely we have already survived finality and have moved into a post-dystopian future that shimmers on the edge of Canada's utopian vision of itself in the contemporary. And I too, like my fellow writer Kinesia Lubrin, I addressed her a little earlier in the essay, like my fellow writer Kinesia Lubrin, have been so plagued by dreams, mostly reoccurring nightmares, that I must ask, what do I/we dream of when the world is on the brink of obliteration? Is insomnia not a byproduct of a world moving towards its end stop? And how do I and we, as disenfranchised folks, use such dreams? I place a desperate but necessary emphasis on the root of this word, obliteration, and huff it into orality. My ideal writing space, then, is in dreams and bedrooms. Me, the bent recorder between kissing worlds, wanting to be heard and touched. Here, I'll lie until dawn, possessed by the need to spill, forgetting even to eat or drink or urinate until I feel the portrait of what I've witnessed is written into plausibility, pliability. Here, I'll listen to classical music to stimulate my thoughts, attuned to the contemporary queer classic reimaginings of Darren Creech and Chris Dirksen, Farrell on key and string, and sing into being the messaging and the warnings and the love coups and the death hymns of that which I witness in the night, only to rinse off in the pupa of morning. I have been summoning my fictional protagonist, Johnny Appleseed, into the dreams of my mind for the past 10 years. And he is a character I have come to know intimately, from chickenpox forehead scar to foreskin to the loop of pubic hair painted onto his toenail. This is what insomnia and dreaming has gifted me. Although I wrote Johnny, I have been astounded by the excitement over and requests for me to read the Musqua or bear topping scene wherein Johnny bottoms for a bear in the mountains of Alberta. There are many dream sequences within Johnny Appleseed that, during the writing and editing processes, I was asked to remove because they distracted from the realism of the novel. Indigenous epistemologies were being meagerly read as magic realism, and thereby as folktale, as mythology, or as fantastical. Surely they can be, but I held steadfast to keeping those dream sequences. They are, in my opinion, the realist senses of Johnny's world as compared with the hellish reality he inhibits as a queer femme indigenous Napeu, or man. As I have been taught, dreams are fundamental to my indigenous knowledge bases, or epistemologies. To many others, they work as systems of instruction. They instruct us as we embody ourselves as others or as avatars. Dreams mend us, they heal us, and they warn and rejuvenate us. I'll leave that there. Thank you.
That was awesome. That was fantastic. I love the voice. I love how assured you are as you're reading from your work. Thank you so much for sharing today, Josh. I am always in awe of your talent. Also, I'm writing nonfiction at the moment, so I'm scared shitless. Can we talk? Anyway.
Send me a text.
I will. We have around 40 people who have joined us today, which is amazing for the post-Zoom era because nobody goes on Zoom anymore, which tells you how amazing you are, folks, and how interested people are to hear your voice. So folks who are with us today, can you please just hit that Q&A section and hit us with your questions. I will come to you around 4:30, 4:35 and try to answer some of your questions. So don't forget to do so. But for now, I have a bajillion question for you. And how about I start with you, Larissa? The question is for everyone, but let's start with Larissa. First things first, how do you describe and define the term magic realism? Do you identify your own writing with the term? Do you find yourself in conversation or even in conflict with the term? How do you relation yourself to the term itself?
Thank you so much, Danny, and thank you for organizing a conference around this topic. I think it's such an important conversation that we're going to have. So in terms of how I think about what magical realism is, because I'm a big nerd and I do research, The term, it originates, in fact, with this this Latin American critic called Angel Flores, but it's not a term that Latin American writers in general tend to love, because many of them also feel pigeonholed by it in a way that I suspect many of us in this room here today also do. So I think it's become this sort of strange marketing category, you know, that kind of comes out of an article written by this one guy who was trying to do something useful. And I think it just got too convoluted, even for many Latin American writers, although, you know, maybe there's a handful who would identify, but I understand there's an even larger handful who don't. So it's already fraught there. And then it's strange how it gets taken up as a marketing category, particularly, you know, in North America, and gets applied often to the work of BIPOC writers, but not exclusively. So it's a very strange in its birth. It's strange the way it gets circulated. I understand that it sells books. It remains troubling. My good friend Kawika Guillermo gave me a really interesting article by a guy called Ramon Saldivar, called The Second Elevation of the Novel, where Saldivar, I think, is trying to think productively about the ways in which he and I prefer that, well, actually, he uses the term post-race, which I don't like so much. He revalences it so that it's, you know, he's not trying to imagine that we're beyond race. He's imagining it post-race as a parallel to post-structural and postmodern. I think it's a little bit too obscure. I would rather just use the term fantastic. But the way that he describes this aesthetic, I actually find really interesting. So he thinks about it as in dialogue with postmodernism, but also coterminous with it, so not derivative of it, but emerging in the same moment among BIPOC writers in North America. And then he says it draws on the history of genres and mixes generic forms. And then he also says it's invested in a range of different kinds of realism that are not, you know, literary realism in its most proper sense, but rather speculative reason, speculative realism, social realism, surrealism, dirty realism, weird realism, and critical realism. These terms also, again, a little bit, they circulate in different kinds of ways, not all useful, but I think just the idea that he's sort of trying to think about the different modes that realism might operate in, that don't have to be, you know, that thing that we've inherited through Western literary history, you know, as realism. I find that really helpful. And then he also specifically pins it to a thematics of race in 21st century America, and I would add Canada. He names a few people, like Colson Whitehead and Karante Yamashita, and yours truly, and a few other writers who are, you know, are doing this kind of experimentation, and says there's something that's actually happening there, that's crystallizing, that's actually productive. Just don't call it magical realism. And then, you know, as I said, he has this other term that I see why he does it. It's not the best. We need a term. The other guy, Strigati, from whom I get this thing about Angel Flores, just says, let's just call it the fantastic and not overcomplicate it. And so that makes a bit of sense to me.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of my own work and how I find myself in conversation with it, I don't use the term magic realism to describe what I'm doing for all the, you know, first of all, you know, it's not my own inheritance. It just sort of feels like something that was manufactured. I would just prefer not to go there. But when we get at this thing that that Saldivar is trying to describe, that I could kind of hang with. And I would be interested in, you know, if there's something sort of forming there in a sort of more productive sense. I could definitely be with that, because the way conventional realism doesn't really work for me either.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, leave it to Larissa to do the research and come to us with all of this. Rasiqra, do you have anything you would like to add to that?
Yeah, I do. That was really a lot to think about and to consider. Larissa, would you mind at some point maybe putting in the chat the name of some of those writers and thinkers? I would love to explore that a little bit more. Thank you so much. So My experience with the term, I haven't applied it very much to my own work, but I think that I think a lot of different terms and like subgenres and typifications are things that I might associate with in the abstract, but then once they become concretized as like marketing terms, I find them significantly more alienating. But there are elements of the concept that speak to me very deeply, actually. And I think something that has been like sort of my looser understanding of a quality that characterizes magic realism is that essentially realism is not sufficient to reflect or interrogate reality, our lived experiences, the way that history informs and lives within us. And in the present moment, the way the future may as well be echoed back to us in ways that we don't immediately understand. It is not sufficient to explore the horror and absurdity of being alive, particularly of being alive and experiencing colonization, experiencing just so many different intersecting systems of oppression and capitalism, and the way that these things impact our lives. Realism just isn't enough. It's not enough to do that. It doesn't. There are so many different ways to tell the truth, and I feel, particularly in poetry, I feel this is very true. And really, it just it needs more. And there are ways that this can communicate significantly more than sort of like straight realism, I guess, which is not the best term. I'm not entirely sure how to phrase that better. And for my own work and my own work, which is very much a reflection of my own thought processes and the way that my mind is able to function, I do find that often metaphor is clearer to me than maybe fact in a way. It is very challenging for me to translate my experiences and my thoughts in ways that are literal, because I do feel that they lose their truth when that happens. And so, yeah, I mean, I don't want to. I'm conscious of the fact that my thoughts tend to knit and become kind of lateral and overwhelming. So I'm trying to keep this a little bit more concise. But in many ways, yeah, the way that I think, which automatically impacts my work and is the source of my work in a lot of respects, it needs something that I understand can be classified as magic realism, even if I don't associate myself or my thinking with that term necessarily.
Yes, I think we as marginalized authors, folks with experiences that might be a bit challenging in the world that we live in, around the systems that we navigate, I think sometimes using the style, the tool of magic realism makes sense to us. Sometimes it feels safer, honestly. So so I agree with you on that. Josh, would you like to add to this conversation?
I think this is a big thing I've been wrestling with, as Larissa is very aware of. I guess like when I think of realism, like what does that even mean? Like our experiences differ based on our experiences. Like our movement through the world differs, even if we are quote unquote human, like based on our class, based on our race, based on our indigeneity, our queerness, our disabilities, our sex, our genders, our sexualities. And so for me, I really contend with and wrestle against this idea of like realism that is so tied to like capital L literature, in that like really the idea of realism is the experience of a white heterosexual man, let's be honest. That is the canon is full of it, right? And that's realist novels. And so for me, I don't ascribe or subscribe to be that. I guess like I have to like I'm like literally turning into an auntie now. To answer that question, I'll tell you 2 other stories. Like my tutelage as a writer was very much like growing up in my great-grand's house on the reservation. And hanging with the women who would tell stories about their lives, or like who they saw, who they slept with at the bingo hall. They all one up each other. But also, like, the stories that we would tell are stories with like star people, or like, we might call aliens in English. There's a reservation near mine, Peguis, called Jackhead, which famously is known by the indigenous folks and the Ukrainian colony who are kin to my reservation. As a UFO apparently crashed there, and there was a full-on military presence. We have stories of little people who are they are quite annoying. They will steal your keys and you have to give them shiny things or jelly beans to get them back, which almost always works. We have our sweat lodges. We have stories of the Manitou or spirits. We have stories of Bigfoot. We have the works of someone like Eden Robinson telling trickster tales. And to me, none of that is like magic realism. None of that is surreal. None of that is fantastical. In fact, it's probably the most, again, like I was noting in the essay I read, it's probably the most realist sense of an indigenous experience. So yeah, I guess like when you have to slap on a barcode for publicity's sake and marketing, a magic realism, right? Or even I'm contending with nonfiction, like I think that's limiting. I have to bring myself back into Nihiayu, or the Cree language. And so I don't call myself a novelist or an essayist or a poet. Really, I just call myself Otachimo. And then the root of that, or the prefix of that word, Otachi, within Cree, it sounds simple, storyteller, but when you translate it, or when you open it up within the Cree sense, it means legend speakers and legend knowers. It means interviewer. It means journalist. It means poet. It means storyteller, novelist. It means the recorder, archiver. So it means all these things, which to me I love because English can't translate it. So it's unknowable and undefinable and unrecognizable. And I think to me, like, I love that because to be unknown to the nation state of Canada in a work of creative work that is, I guess, nonfiction or all the kind of cross-genre, bastardizing myself to gender and genre work I do, I very much think to not be known or to not be able to be defined is like very radically freeing, which I love. And I guess maybe I align myself with the work of Daniel Heath Justice in his book, Why Indigenous Literatures Matter, who offers the term wonderworking. And he's basically as a bricolage of intersecting stories that might include what we call fantasy or speculative fiction or horror or realism or poetics. And he says, wondrous things are other and otherwise. And I think I subscribe to that way of thinking of wonderworking, in that I guess I can speak for like indigenous stories, at least Korean Ojibwe stories, in that our writing and our stories include the speculative, include horror, and include the everyday real experiences of colonization, and include futurisms, and include ghosts and star people. So I'm like, what genre fits for us? So again, I can just kind of bring it all back to the idea of that story, right? And I take pretty big offense, I think, sometimes with the expectation of, non-Indigenous readerships and publishing and marketing teams to have to like label simplicity through this idea of genre, which for me doesn't exist. And I think I work within and without genre.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I love the way that you describe the term that you use to describe yourself and how it has no translation in English. So in Arabic, in Syrian Arabic specifically, when you're talking about a storyteller, you call them hakawati. And it comes from the word hikaya, which literally means a fairy tale. But the beauty of the way that the verb, the noun is created, it's that it's created as an interactive noun, which means that it's not about storytelling. It's about the person standing there telling the story, and about how the community listening to the story is interacting with it. So part of the art of Hakawati back in Damascus is that the Hakawati would sit in a cafe and tell a story and the stories will have magical elements in them, like phoenixes and ghouls and the Sinbads of the world and all of that. But part of the interaction of it is that the community will start asking questions, and the Hakawati will have to tell the story that way. We'll have to answer those questions. Or if the protagonist had a very difficult experience, the community will start shouting "Ya batal," which means "what a shame." It's the way for the community to interact with the story. So I love that quite a lot, and I think it takes me to my next question, which is about the relationship that we have between us as writers and our communities that are marginalized or pushed aside, and the term magic realism. It does feel like, yes, it is not exclusively used for folks of color or queer folks or disabled folks in describing our arts, but it does feel like a stamp of approval for our work. It does feel like something that we're marketed through. And I'm wondering about how do you feel about the relationship between that term and your identity as however you identify, and how do you feel the relationship between that term and the community that, whether we like it or not, the mainstream society still think of us as representative of? How about I stay with you, Josh, and then we go further?
Yeah, I mean, I think that label points to, at least from my perspective, with an OG Cree perspective, of like reading our stories as pulp and fiber, and it's like, moving into the longevity of like the Harlequin, and it cheapens it really to me, to say, please come read this magical realist book. And it's just not something that like it fits around what I'm doing, because I think how I'm working with it and what it's moving through implodes this kind of the self-imposed boundary and border of something like labeling it with genre, really, but magic realism at its finest. And it's funny to me because, like, I think I also really side with my dear friend Billy Ray Belcourt, who writes that like Indigenous joy is like radical resistance and freedom. And I'm really trying to move beyond the vein of having Indigenous stories be a synecdoche or a synonym for residential school narratives. Like last year, I love this book and I love this writer, but Michelle Good won Canada Reads with 5 Little Indians. And it just like increases the hunger and the thirst for residential school narratives to be equal, like the equal sign equals Indigenous stories. And I really love the work that folks that are doing now, Indigenous people who are doing now, specifically the queer and trans communities, of like writing fantastical stories that are embedded within their cultural and oral histories. And to me, like that's Indigenous joy right there, and that's the futurity, but it's also history. It's the contemporary, and I just don't see it as like magic realism. But again, from an outside voyeuristic point of view, it may perhaps look like that, but I think that's just the training that we receive in this nation state that we refer to as Canada, but also in the West or global North, of like reading the story of the subaltern or the other as like confession or as inherently memoir. Like the eyes of our stories are always inherently read as an autobiographical pact with us as the writers, in which they are not often. So yeah, I guess I just kind of really, I really kind of take offense, like not offense, but I do not want to be identified in the realm of genre, at least in the Western understandings of what we know as genre. Because it's also just another way of othering, I feel like. It's another way, again, for the sake of sales and marketing and publicity, you need to have these. So you can put them on, when you buy in the sales. I was just laughing because my audiobook is labeled as historical fiction for Making Love with the Land. I was like, what? Someone's going to be like listening to like a World War II audiobook and come across Making Love with the Land and be like, what in the poof is happening? But it's just like it's a mechanic, streamlined, neat way to position, for at least BIPOC writers, and more specifically, my understanding, Indigenous writers along the peripheries, and not allowing space for recognition or awards or mass second, third, fourth printings, unless it's kind of sold as like mythology or folktale, which cheapens it to in a way that is like, as we understand, like, for example, like young adult novels, we all say it's like our guilty pleasure to read it. And I kind of feel when you ascribe these labels of genre to our stories, it puts us in a position in which it's like guilty pleasure almost, or it feels non-literary. Either educational or it's supposed to be entertaining. And I think our work, all of our work, does both of those and is highly political.
I love what you said about the I always ending up being autobiographical. I received a lot of reviews for my first novel, The Clothesline Swing, about how autobiographical it is. And then now with the next book, The Foghorn Echoes, which you should read. I read it once, I loved it. With this book, I'm also receiving some reviews where people are like, this is autobiographical. And I'm like, how many lives do you think I lived for me to write 2 novels and both of them be autobiographical? And that tells me about the relationship from the mainstream society, in which me as a writer cannot. Also, my characters meet angels and ghosts in my book. Like how high do you think I was?
We're all tricksters, Danny. We're all tricksters. So that
I will take that. I will enjoy that title. Larissa, do you want to add more about the relationship between identity and magic realism?
Oh, sure, Danny. I mean, I felt a lot of those pressures too when I was starting. There was a real hunger in that moment for autobiographical fictions and or memoir or straight autobiography from Asian Canadian writers. And it was something that I really resisted because I didn't like that idea that, I was sort of confessing my life and the life of my family for the sake of the prurient interest of a white readership. And I think that's one of the reasons, in fact, why I sort of, veered towards what I would then have called speculative fiction or experimental fiction, was exactly to sort of get away from that kind of prying gaze. But I mean, for me, the flip side of it was people, they didn't know what to do with it. So they wouldn't call it magical realism. They would just say it's not very good because it's not very realistic. And I think that that's, in fact, been one of my struggles, is that sort of generically, I'm not really doing what mainstream publishing expects. And so the work only gets so far, and it's a frustration. But then in terms of, so that's a frustration around publishing. But if I have something to say about it in terms of what I think I'm actually doing, I would say, I would agree with, what you've said and what Josh said just now, that our own literary traditions and our own ways of perceiving the world are rich with all of these things, with spirits and critters and ghosts and fortune tellers and curses and prayers and unexpected things rushing up from the water, and transformations and transmutations and returns back to the human, and that is a kind of, one can understand that as a kind of realism. It's just not the realism of 20 and 21st century kind of Western literary expectation. And so if I have an interest in doing this kind of work, it's, it's what Saldivar is talking about. He's sort of trying to describe, I think the essay is incomplete, but the project is really important, that he's trying to describe what's happening in works like ours and explain what, show us why it's political, what's political about it, what's interesting about it, and to help readers read it as well. And I think that, that can only be a good thing. And the other thing that I would say about it as well is that, frustrated though I might be with the way the mainstream does or does not take up my work, you guys read it and like it, and you're an excellent audience. And I want you as my first audience. Like, okay, those other people, they probably have more money, but you're listening better. And
yes, I love that. Yes.
Yeah. And I think it's just sort of really important that we we think about what the work is doing on its own terms among ourselves, or I mean, across, vast fields of difference and power and balance as well, obviously, even within, so-called BIPOC communities. And I just want to recognize that, not to make that assumption that we read one another transparently and just get it. But I do think that within our communities, there's the will to sort of, to read the work and to make sense of it on its own terms, and to not really be all that interested in what the market is doing or isn't doing. And for me, that's really important. And then one of the things that I also wanted to say, that I sort of realized in relation to this particular novel, but I think I was actually doing it in some of the prior ones, is for me, the work, in those moments when I'm moving away from conventional realism, it's often because there's something that's been forgotten, or something that's been erased, or there's a memory that's been lost. And so sometimes for me in practice, the engagement with non-realist modes, I actively do it as a way of trying to make sense of the things that have been lost. And I think that's why it sort of feels so acutely important, and why I keep doing it, why I refuse that sort of conventional understanding of autobiography.
Mhm, mhm, mhm. I was having a conversation once with Isabel Lindy about Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and this is the kind of life that I lead. I have conversations with Isabel Lindy about Gabriel Garcia Marquez.
Awesome.
I know, I met her when she came to UBC.
Amazing.
I know, she's amazing. I loved her. But she was describing a scene in 100 Years of Solitude where a woman is whisked away while she is putting the laundry on the laundry, on the clotheslines, and whisked away by angels. And she's like, this is how Gabriel Garcia Marquez described this, and it's used to magic realism concept. And she was saying how in reality what happened is that the woman escaped with a lover that the family didn't agree with. So the story that the family was saying to everybody is that she was whisked away by angels to the sky. And Isabel was like, and where's the problem with both stories being real? Both stories can absolutely coexist, and both stories can be narratives that we all accept and believe. It is about the family telling both stories, whichever way that works for the family. And I think that is something I never thought about before. And I think that is where the community is telling a story with magic realism that's part of how the story is told. That's part of how the identity is presented.
And the two stories hold up different values, Danny. So the story of running away with the lover holds up the value of love, but the story of disappearing with the laundry holds up family honor or something in a conservative way. But it's still done to sort of hold, to hold something up. And I think that's the thing that I find so powerful about working in this kind of way, where the sort of white world wants confession, but with confession often shame is attached, right? Which is why I refuse to confess so many things, because why would I do that? Why would I do that? Why would I hurt my family in that kind of way, or myself? But so if there's something else that you can put in the place of, so that it's possible to read it two ways, then I think it both protects and reveals at the same time. And sometimes it can be more revealing, strangely, but without enacting the harm. And so there's power there.
That.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. Rasiqra, how do you feel about this conversation between identity and magic realism?
This is fantastic, by the way. And Larissa, what you were just saying about like the ability to be read in multiple ways. Man, do I ever identify with that? That's really terrific. And I also when I was first starting out and doing like poetic exercises and things like with workshops, I would struggle a lot with the like autobiographical I, the imposition of that. And I remember I used to, preface the work by saying like, this is actually not me. This is some other experience, even though of course there's some me there. But it was so frustrating the way, even if there were times that something was a little bit closer to my experience, something closer to autobiography, once that enters the picture, you lose all discussion of the art or you as an artist, or this was my experience, you know, there's nothing about craft anymore. There's nothing about, you know, the actual decisions and the really prolonged thought and theoretical intentions. None of that is there anymore. It's just about what is your body, what has happened to your body, what are you doing with your body, and who is doing it to you, and so on. And it's exhausting, and it feels, it makes it feel, or it did initially when I was starting, before I started just being really fucking weird. There was no space to be an artist there. There just wasn't. Like the shape of whatever box they were creating was just, I don't know, math, non-Euclidean. It was terrible. I couldn't fit. I couldn't even, there was no space inside it. It was all lines and edges and entirely too many corners. And I think something that was really helpful for me is that around the same time that I was first getting started, I also met and was going to school with and started having like really, really incredible literary discussions with the writer who would end up editing Cephalopography 2.0, who's Kinesia Lubrin. And we were able to discuss everything that went into the poems, every facet of it, regardless of whether that meant, you know, disclosing trauma or discussing like broader socio-political issues, or, you know, really kind of niche scientific information about a squid. And all of that could be understood as, you know, something that is informing my decisions and my thinking around form or technique, spacing, imagery, symbolism, the way these things echo and connect with each other. And we were able to be honest about those things, but never like it never impinged at all. It allowed me to really flourish as an artist and to not to, you know, really focus on the discipline and the thinking that was required, because obviously there's like a lot of intuition to it. I do also do a lot of my writing when I'm asleep or in dreams, but it's a very tight balance that is, it's very difficult to talk about when you're being reduced to autobiography. And maybe this is one of the reasons that some of my most personal poems are also about an octopus digging in the sand or making the shape of a fish, because it speaks to me about survival and the difficulty there, the necessity there. Yeah, I think I had something else to say, but I got excited and I stopped taking notes. But it's definitely very complicated, trying to consider things like, you know, marketing. And as much as I do try to be, you know, to work with my press and not be, you know, so difficult for them to figure out what to do, in some ways, working in like small press poetry, there's a lot less pressure and expectation for you to like sell books. It's poetry, it's small press. And I was extremely lucky working with Woolsack to be able to have the freedom to make the choices for my book that were speaking to what I needed it to be, what was true for me. They certainly suggested things like, you know, maybe a title that people can say, that they know what it is when they look at it. But it was, when I could freely explain like what my reasoning was, it was completely accepted. And I think, yeah, it's complicated. I've been lucky, but it's complicated.
Thank you so much, Rasiqra. I wrote you in the email preparing for this over 7 questions. And I didn't realize that you folks, we are going to have this conversation, and then time does exist apparently, and we don't live in a continuum of beautiful literature. And we are around time, but I want to take at least one of the questions from the audience. So folks, I am going to look at the questions right here. I see Farzana Doctor, we love Farzana Doctor. Please let's say hi to Farzana Doctor. She is amazing and she's fantastic in every way. She has a question. She says, beautiful readings, all of you. Thank you. A question for you all. Many of us are from colonized peoples. And for me, this sometimes means I'm not sure whether the magical elements are coming from ancestral culture, spirituality, versus my own mind and my own psyche. So I don't know how to slot it or claim it. Maybe this doesn't matter. Would love to hear your thoughts. And please, let's keep it a bit short because we have 5 minutes remaining. How about I start with you, Larissa?
Oh, thank you. It's a wonderful question, Farzana. Nice to have you in the room. I would, you know, my initial reaction to that question is they might be the same thing. That the ancestors in your imagination, they're, I mean, it depends on how one engages, you know, if you're sort of tearing at it and sort of trying to drag something out of the imagination, then it's probably not. But I think if it rises in the imagination kind of as you're working, and especially if you're working in a fairly straight way and something just rises, that is the imagination, but I think it might also be the ancestors. But I also think you can tell, I think you can feel it. And I think you can know. But this is not obviously not science, not a science. This is just a way, right, of thinking about the way that the work works. I think they might be, or they can be the same.
Thank you so much, Larissa. I love that answer. I feel like we all nodded and we all agreed with it. So I'm just going to jump to a different question so we can get folks all happy and answered. So this question is for you, Joshua, actually. How do you, this is coming from Noah. They ask, how do you connect with your dreams to channel them into your writing? What is your process around translating the dream space into language?
Oh, okay. I'll try to answer this quickly too. Sometimes I take a lot of notes. So in my phone, I have a notepad near my bed and I try to like remember the textures, but I also have very episodic dreams. I don't know if it's just me. Sometimes I can go back to sleep and go right back into that dream. And I've kind of trained myself over the 33 years I've been on this earth to remember them fairly well. But I always have to verbalize them in the morning. So usually I'll text my sister at like 7 a.m. and be like, I just dreamed this goat who fell off a cliff and became a bat or something like that. And she's like, what the hell are you talking about? But I have to verbalize it to remember it. And so I always write them down. And then I place them on a page and I can kind of jump right back into that moment. And maybe I'll just like quickly piggyback this with Farzana's as well. I agree with Larissa. I think the imagination or the psyche is ancestral. I know my student Omar's here. He's probably sick of me talking about Cormac McCarthy, but Cormac McCarthy has this great essay called The Kekulé Problem, which is about Auguste Kekulé, a chemist who discovered benzene by having a dream of a snake eating its own tail. And he basically writes that our unconscious, which I think is ancestral knowledge, knows everything and what's going to happen and what has happened and what will happen. And I think it's just our job as dreamers and as writers to translate what we can from this unconscious into the page. And sometimes I think that takes the form of magical realism, but more specifically, I think that takes the form of like ancestor speaking. And for me, that comes in the form of dreams. So verbalizing it and taking note and placing on the page like a little seedling.
Thank you so much, Joshua. I never remember my dreams, but mainly because I take medication for that. Thank you, everyone. Today, I really enjoyed myself. I'm sorry we didn't get to hear more from you, Rasiqra, because we're about time. And I am so lucky. I'm so thankful that I get to call you folks my friends, and I get to hang out with you in this internet sphere that we live in. And I'm really looking forward to seeing you in person one day soon. Until then, folks in Victoria can see me in a couple of